The air in West Texas in the year of our Lord 1866 was thick with more than just dust and the simmering heat of a relentless sun. It was heavy with the ghosts of a brutal war, the scent of gunpowder, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. For Deputy Marshal Elias Thorne, a man who had seen the horrors of Shiloh and the grim aftermath of Antietam, this particular scent was unnervingly familiar, yet profoundly alien. He knelt in the ochre-colored dirt, the cracked leather of his boots sinking slightly into the sun-baked earth. Before him lay what was left of a man named Silas Croft, a card-sharpened drifter who had been last seen 3 nights prior, flashing a fat roll of winnings at the Gilded Cage Saloon. The body was splayed in a grotesque parody of sleep, limbs askew, eyes wide open, and staring at a sky that offered no answers. But it wasn't the unseeing eyes or the swarm of black flies that held Thorne's attention. It was the gaping, almost surgically precise cavity in the man's chest. The ribs had been cracked open, the sternum splintered, and the space where a beating heart should have been was now a hollow, bloody chasm. It was a macabre, disturbing void, a testament to an act of incomprehensible violence. This was not the work of a common thief or a desperate outlaw. Robbers took your purse, not your organs. This was something else entirely, something ritualistic, something deeply, personally horrifying. As Thorne's gaze swept the scene, he noticed something glinting near Silas's cold, stiff hand. A single playing card. The Queen of Hearts, its pristine surface marred by a single, deliberate thumbprint of dried blood. The town of Perdition, Texas, was little more than a scar on the face of the frontier, a haphazard collection of wooden shacks, canvas tents, and one imposing, 2-story saloon that seemed to suck all the life and light from the dusty Main Street. It was a town born of desperation, populated by men running from their pasts and women clinging to precarious futures. The Civil War had ended, but peace was a foreign concept here. This was a land governed by the gun and the gold piece, where a man's life was worth less than the liquor in his glass. Deputy Thorne rode back into this volatile settlement with the grim news of Silas Croft's discovery, the blood-marked Queen of Hearts tucked safely in his saddlebag. The discovery of a dead body was hardly news in Perdition. A week without a shooting was a cause for celebration. But the manner of Croft's death sent a ripple of unease through the hardened populace. When Thorne described the missing heart, the saloon went quiet. Men who had faced down Comanche war parties and survived Confederate prison camps looked at each other with a new kind of fear in their eyes. This wasn't the clean, brutal violence they understood. This was something dark, something forbidden. Whispers began to circulate like poison, old tales and superstitions bubbling to the surface. They spoke of skinwalkers, of ancient curses brought over from the old country, of dark spirits that roamed the chaparral, hungry for the souls of wicked men. But the old-timers, the ones who had been in Perdition since its founding, whispered a different name, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. They spoke of Eliza, the girl they called Lucky Lily, the new singer at the Gilded Cage Saloon. Eliza May, known to the patrons of the Gilded Cage as Lily, was a paradox wrapped in cheap lace and smelling of whiskey and rosewater. She had arrived in Perdition 6 months prior, a ghost drifting in on the evening stagecoach with nothing but a small carpet-bag and a pair of eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the war. She was beautiful, but it was a severe, haunting beauty. Her hair was the color of midnight, her skin as pale as bleached bone, and her gaze was a cold, unnerving thing that could make a man feel like he was being measured for a coffin. Yet, men were drawn to her like moths to a candle flame, desperate to bask in her fleeting warmth, to buy her a drink, to hear her sing the sad, mournful ballads that seemed to echo the emptiness in their own souls. She moved with an ethereal grace, a phantom at the center of the saloon's chaotic swirl of cigar smoke, spilled liquor, and desperation. The saloon owner, a corpulent, sweat-stained man named Silas Blackwood, considered her his greatest asset. Since Lee's arrival, the Gilded Cage had seen a run of incredible luck. The card tables paid out fortunes, prospectors who drank at her tables struck silver, and cattle drives that started with a toast from her hand never lost a single head. They called her Lucky Lily, a living charm in a godforsaken town. But behind this veneer of fortune, a darker reputation was growing. Men who won her favor for a night often boasted of their luck turning, and some of those men, after a particularly big win, had a tendency to simply vanish. The disappearances had been subtle at first, easily missed in a transient town like Perdition. A gambler who won big and supposedly left for San Francisco. A trapper who collected his pay and headed for the mountains. A lone cowboy who drank his wages and rode off into the sunset. These were common occurrences, the natural ebb and flow of life on the frontier. No one kept close track of drifters. They were ghosts even when they were alive, their pasts erased, their futures uncertain. But Marshall Thorne, a methodical man by nature, started to see a pattern. It began as a nagging feeling, an itch in the back of his mind. He began a quiet inventory, speaking with stable owners, merchants, and the town's lone, overworked blacksmith. The list of the vanished began to grow. There was Dakota Dan, a card player who won a legendary pot 3 months ago and was never seen again. 2 brothers, the Miller boys, who had bragged about a small gold strike and had bought the entire saloon a round of drinks from Lily's hand. They disappeared 2 nights later. And now Silas Croft, whose luck at the faro table had been the talk of the town, was found in a shallow grave, his chest hollowed out. Each man had 2 things in common: a recent spectacular stroke of good fortune and a final memorable encounter with Lucky Lily. The connection was circumstantial, of course, a coincidence. But in Thorne's experience, too many coincidences eventually formed a horrifying truth. He began to watch the saloon girl, not as another face in the crowd, but as a predator stalking her hunting grounds. He was now investigating a potential cold case that was growing warmer by the day. Thorne started his quiet investigation by speaking to the other women who worked at the Gilded Cage. They were a mix of hardened survivors and broken dreamers, each with her own story of loss and compromise. When he asked about Lily, their reactions were a strange cocktail of envy, fear, and a guarded, almost reverential respect. "She keeps to herself," said a girl named Clara, her eyes darting nervously towards the corner where Lily was polishing glasses. "Doesn't talk about where she came from. Just appeared." Another woman, Maeve, a fiery redhead with a cynical laugh, was more forthcoming, albeit in hushed tones. "They say she's got the devil's own luck. Men who court her, they prosper. Men who cross her, well, they tend to move on real sudden-like." Maeve told a particularly creepy story. A few weeks back, a belligerent rancher had gotten drunk and grabbed Lily too roughly. Lily hadn't screamed or fought back. She had simply stared at him with her cold, dark eyes and whispered something in his ear. The man turned pale, dropped his hands as if he'd been burned, and left the saloon without another word. The next morning, his prize stallion, the pride of his ranch, was found dead in its stable, its heart inexplicably missing. The vet called it a freak occurrence, a predator of some kind. But Maeve and the other girls knew. It was a warning. Lucky Lily's fortune was a double-edged sword, and its price was a thing of macabre legend. The more Thorne learned, the more he realized he wasn't just investigating a murder. He was wading into a local folklore, a disturbing myth that was beginning to feel terrifyingly real. To understand the present, Thorne knew he had to dig into Eliza May's past. It was a frustrating, almost impossible task. In 1866, people could reinvent themselves with little more than a new name and a fast horse. Records were scarce, and memories were unreliable. He sent telegraphs to marshals in larger Texan cities, San Antonio, Austin, Galveston, asking if they had any records of a woman matching her description, perhaps connected to similar strange occurrences. The replies were slow to come, and none were helpful. It was as if she had sprung from the earth itself, a fully formed enigma. Thorne then turned his attention back to the saloon and its owner, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a man whose greed was exceeded only by his cowardice. When Thorne questioned him about Lily, the saloon owner became defensive. "She's good for business, Marshall. That's all I know. Sings like an angel and the menfolk love her. Keeps 'em drinkin', keeps 'em gamblin'." But as Thorne pressed him, detailing the growing list of missing men, a flicker of fear appeared in Blackwood's beady eyes. He lowered his voice, mopping his sweaty brow with a stained handkerchief. "Look, she came here on the evening stage from East Texas. Said she was an orphan of the war. Her family was wiped out by bushwhackers near the Sabine River. That's all she ever told me." The story was tragic, plausible, and utterly unverifiable. It was the perfect history for a ghost, a tale of sorrow that invited sympathy while revealing nothing. But the detail about the Sabine River, a region notorious for its lawlessness and grim folklore, lodged itself in Thorne's mind. It was a breadcrumb, and in a case this cold, a single breadcrumb could lead through the darkest of forests. The folklore of East Texas was a different breed from the cowboy legends of the West. It was older, darker, steeped in the superstitions of the Deep South and the bayous. Thorne, having spent time there, knew the stories. Tales of the Rougarou, of hoodoo and conjure women, of things that lurked in the cypress swamps and demanded a blood price for their favors. The idea of a young woman, orphaned by violence in such a place, resonated with a disturbing chill. What horrors might she have witnessed? What dark knowledge might a desperate survivor have sought out in order to endure? He recalled tales of folk magic, of rituals meant to steal another's luck or life force. These were forbidden stories, whispered by frightened people in firelit cabins, but they contained a kernel of belief that was powerful and dangerous. Could Lily's luck be something she hadn't been born with, but something she had acquired? The thought was outlandish, the stuff of penny dreadfuls, but the hollowed-out chest of Selah's Croft was a brutal fact that defied rational explanation. The Queen of Hearts in his hand felt less like a random calling card and more like a piece of a horrifying puzzle. The heart, in these old beliefs, was the seat of courage, of life, of luck. To possess another's heart was to possess their essence. The macabre theory began to form in Thorne's mind, so monstrous he could barely give it shape. Eliza May wasn't just a singer. She was a practitioner of some forgotten, blood-soaked craft. She wasn't bringing luck, she was harvesting it. Thorne decided to observe Lily directly, to watch her as she worked her magic on the patrons of the Gilded Cage. He took a corner table, nursing a single whiskey for hours, becoming part of the shadows. From this vantage point, he watched her move through the room. She was a master of her craft. She had a unique ability to make every man feel as if he were the only one in the room. A soft touch on the arm, a lingering gaze, a whispered word of encouragement as he laid down a bet. She was an artist, and her medium was male ego. Thorne noticed her ritual. She never approached a man who was losing. She only ever engaged with those on a winning streak, men flush with confidence and the intoxicating thrill of good fortune. She would drift to their side, her presence like a blessing. She would offer to blow on their dice for luck, or let them touch the locket she always wore around her neck. And invariably, their luck would soar. They would win bigger, their cheers growing louder, their generosity overflowing. They would buy her drinks, slip gold coins into her hand, and toast her name. They saw her as their angel, their lady luck. But Thorne saw something else. He saw a farmer inspecting her livestock. He saw a predator selecting the fattest buck from the herd. She wasn't celebrating their fortune. She was cultivating it, nurturing it, waiting for it to be ripe for the harvest. The air in the saloon, once filled with boisterous hope, now felt suffocatingly sinister to the marshal. The whispers and rumors were just the beginning of this town's nightmare. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden corners of history, consider subscribing to our channel, because the trail of blood and superstition is about to lead somewhere truly horrifying. A new player arrived in Perdition, a high-stakes gambler from New Orleans who called himself Beau Leclerc. He was everything the dusty cowboys of Perdition were not, dressed in a fine silk vest and tailored coat, with manicured hands that handled cards with the deftness of a surgeon. He carried an air of aristocratic confidence and a satchel heavy with gold. His arrival sent a buzz through the Gilded Cage. Here was a true challenge, a man who could potentially break the bank. For 2 nights, Leclerc dominated the poker table, his quiet, calculating style dismantling the local hopefuls. He was polite, almost charming, but his eyes were like chips of ice. On the 3rd night, Lily finally approached him. She had watched him from afar, her usual calculating gaze now holding a spark of what looked to Thorne like professional curiosity. She glided to his table, her voice a low purr. "A man of your skill shouldn't drink alone," she said, placing a bottle of the finest French brandy before him. Leclerc looked up, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "And what does a nightingale like you know of a hawk's business?" he asked. Lily's own smile was serene, yet held a razor's edge. "I know that even hawks can fall from the sky," she replied softly. "Perhaps you could use a little luck." The challenge was laid. The entire saloon watched, transfixed, as the professional gambler and the town's living curse began their subtle dance. It was a clash of two powerful, mysterious forces, and Thorne felt a cold certainty that it would end in bloodshed. For the next few hours, the poker game between Beau Leclerc and a handful of wealthy ranchers became the center of the universe in perdition, and at its core was the strange, silent battle between Leclerc and Lily. She stood behind his chair, a silent, beautiful specter. She didn't whisper advice or touch his cards. She simply watched, but her presence changed the energy at the table. Leclerc, who had been an unstoppable force, began to falter. A winning hand would be beaten by an impossible draw. A confident bluff would be called without hesitation. His pile of chips began to dwindle, siphoned off by men who seemed to be playing with a newfound, almost divine intuition. Leclerc's polished composure began to crack. A sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. His movements became jerky, his sips of brandy more frequent. He kept glancing over his shoulder at Lily, his icy eyes now filled with a mixture of fury and superstitious dread. He was a man who believed only in skill and probability, and he was being dismantled by something he couldn't explain. The other men at the table, meanwhile, were jubilant. They laughed, they drank, they toasted Lily's name. They were living proof of her power. As the night wore on, Thorne realized what was happening. She wasn't giving the other men luck. She was draining it from Leclerc, isolating him, turning him from a predator into prey. It was a horrifyingly intimate and public display of her alleged power, a demonstration meant for everyone and no one to see. The curse was real, and it was hungry. The game ended just before dawn. Beau Leclerc was ruined. His satchel of gold was gone, distributed among the ecstatic ranchers. He sat slumped in his chair, a broken man, staring at the empty table with the vacant eyes of a ghost. The other players in their drunken revelry slapped him on the back, offering condescending condolences. Lily, her work done, drifted away from the table without a word and disappeared up the stairs to her private room. Leclerc remained motionless as the saloon slowly emptied out. Thorne approached him cautiously. "Tough night," the marshal said, his voice low. Leclerc looked up, his face a mask of pale, sweating rage. "It was her," he hissed, his voice trembling. "That witch. She did something. It wasn't just cards. It was a hex. I felt it, cold, crawling up my spine." He grabbed Thorne's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "In New Orleans we have stories. Women who can steal a man's soul through a deck of cards. They call them les dames de coeur, the heart ladies. They mark you for ruin." Thorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. The Queen of Hearts found with Silas Croft's body. The heart ladies. The pieces were slotting together, forming a picture more macabre than he could have ever imagined. Leclerc, a man of supposed sophistication, was describing the same dark magic the superstitious old-timers in perdition whispered about. It seemed this forbidden folklore wasn't confined to the backwoods of Texas. It had roots that ran deep into the dark heart of the South. Leclerc pushed himself away from the table, stumbling towards the saloon doors. "I'm leaving this cursed town," he slurred, more to himself than to Thorne. "I'll not end up like the others." "The others?" Thorne's senses sharpened. "What others?" he demanded, following the gambler out into the gray light of dawn. Leclerc laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You think you're the only one who's noticed, the men who vanish. I've been in towns like this before, places with a lucky girl, a golden touch. It's always the same story. Men win big, they get friendly with the girl, and then they disappear. Their luck runs out permanently." He turned to face Thorne, his eyes wild with a mixture of fear and alcohol. "She marked me tonight. I felt her do it, when she stood behind me. It was like she reached right into my chest and put her cold hand on my heart. He shuddered violently, then seemed to shrink, his bravado evaporating, replaced by a primal terror. He scurried away towards the livery stable, a man running for his life. Thorne stood alone in the dusty street as the sun began to rise, the gambler's words echoing in his mind. She reached right into my chest. It was no longer a vague suspicion. It was a terrifying, tangible threat. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that Beau Leclerc was now a marked man. And Eliza, Lily, May would not let her prey escape. Thorne didn't let Leclerc out of his sight. He watched from a distance as the gambler retrieved his horse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely cinch the saddle. Leclerc threw fearful glances over his shoulder, as if expecting to see Lily's spectral form in every shadow. He mounted his horse and spurred it into a gallop, kicking up a cloud of dust as he fled perdition, as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. Thorne had a decision to make. He could follow Leclerc, try to protect him and perhaps catch Lily in the act. Or he could use the gambler's flight as a diversion to finally search the one place he hadn't yet been, Lily's room above the saloon. The risk was enormous. If she discovered him, his investigation would be blown and she would vanish like smoke. But if he didn't act, Leclerc would almost certainly become another ghost on the prairie, another body with a hollowed-out chest. He chose the latter. Leclerc was a lure, drawing the predator's attention away from her den. With the saloon quiet and its inhabitants either sleeping off their winnings or their losses, this was his only chance to find concrete evidence, to uncover the truth behind the horrifying curse of Lucky Lily. He slipped around to the back of the gilded cage, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker, and began to look for a way up to the second floor, his heart pounding with a grim and fearful anticipation of what he might find. The window to Lily's room was unlocked. It was an unsettling detail. She was either supremely confident or had nothing of value to hide. Thorne slid the window up, the sound of the weathered wood grating in the silence of the morning. He slipped inside, his boots making no sound on the threadbare rug. The room was sparse, almost monastic. It contained a simple iron-frame bed, neatly made, a small washstand with a porcelain basin, and a single wooden wardrobe. The air was thick with the scent of rosewater and something else, something coppery and faintly medicinal. It was eerily clean, unnaturally tidy for a room in a dusty frontier saloon. There were no personal effects, no letters, no photographs. It was the room of a transient, a person with no past and no connections. He moved to the wardrobe and opened it. Inside hung a few simple dresses, all in dark colors. Beneath them sat her small carpet bag, the one she'd arrived in town with. He lifted it. It was heavier than it should be. With a growing sense of dread, he carried the bag to the bed and unfastened the leather straps. He opened the flap and looked inside. At first, all he saw were bundles of dried herbs, yarrow, sage, and others he didn't recognize. But as he pushed them aside, his fingers brushed against something cool, smooth, and round. He pulled it out. It was a glass canning jar, filled with a murky, brownish liquid, and floating within it, pale and hideously distinct, was a human heart. Thorne stared at the jar, his mind struggling to process the macabre reality of it. The organ floated in the preserving fluid, a grotesque trophy suspended in time. Taped to the outside of the jar was a small, hand-written label. It read, Dakota Dan. His blood ran cold. He reached back into the bag, his hand trembling. He pulled out another jar, then another. There were 5 in total. Each contained a human heart. Each bore a label with a name he recognized from his list of the vanished. The Miller brothers were there, their names written on 2 separate jars. A drifter named Jebediah Smith, and finally a fresher, more recent acquisition, its label simply reading, Selassie. The coppery, medicinal smell in the room now made horrifying sense. It was the scent of formaldehyde, the smell of preserved death. This was her collection, her source of luck. Each jar was a testament to a life she had snuffed out, a soul she had consumed. The whispers, the folklore, the gambler's terrified rantings, it was all true. He was standing in the den of a monster, a creature far more terrifying than any outlaw or gunslinger he had ever faced. He had found his evidence, but the discovery brought no relief, only a profound, soul-deep horror. He was now faced with a new, terrifying question. What was he going to do about it? He couldn't just arrest her. A collection of bottled organs would be dismissed by a frontier judge as a hoax, a macabre prank. He needed more. He needed to catch her in the act of her horrifying ritual. Leaving the jars exactly as he found them, Thorne slipped back out of the room, his mind reeling. He was no longer just a lawman, he was a hunter of the unnatural. He now understood that Lily would be going after Beau Leclerc. The gambler wasn't just a victim, he was the next ingredient for her collection. Thorne saddled his horse, his movements precise and mechanical, his thoughts racing. He had to get to Leclerc first. He rode out of perdition, following the tracks the fleeing gambler had left in the dust. The trail was easy to follow. Leclerc had been riding hard and recklessly, pushing his horse to its limit. Thorne rode for hours under the oppressive Texas sun. The horrifying image of the jars burned into his mind. He scanned the horizon, the vast, empty landscape offering no comfort, only an overwhelming sense of isolation. This was a land where a person could vanish without a trace, where screams were swallowed by the endless sky. As the afternoon wore on, he found Leclerc's horse. It was wandering aimlessly, its reins trailing in the dust, its flanks lathe. Red in sweat, the saddle was empty. Thorne dismounted, drawing his revolver, every nerve on high alert. He followed the horse's back trail on foot, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a struggle. He found Leclerc about 100 yards away, crumpled at the base of a rocky outcrop. He was alive, but barely. A massive gash on his head was bleeding freely, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. His horse had thrown him. In his haste to escape one monster, he had fallen victim to the unforgiving wilderness. "She's coming for me," Leclerc rasped, his eyes wide with feverish terror as Thorne knelt beside him. "I can feel it, the curse. It's not just bad luck, it clings to you." Thorne gave the man a sip of water from his canteen. "You fell, your horse threw you, that's all." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. It was too perfect, too convenient. Lily's curse didn't need to be supernatural. It could be a simple manipulation of events, a self-fulfilling prophecy. She filled her victims with such terror that they made fatal mistakes. She didn't need to chase them down. She let the fear do the work for her. Thorne did his best to bind Leclerc's head wound and fashion a crude splint for his leg. The man was in no condition to be moved far. As twilight began to paint the sky in shades of purple and blood orange, Thorne knew they were vulnerable. He helped Leclerc to a small, defensible hollow in the rocks, a place where they could see anyone approaching from a distance. He built a small, smokeless fire, more for comfort than for warmth. The immense silence of the prairie pressed in on them. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the scrub brush sounded like a footstep. Thorne sat with his rifle across his lap, his back against the rock, and waited. He was now the guardian of the offering, standing between the wolf and the lamb. He knew she would come. The harvest was due. The night was long and filled with a suffocating tension. Leclerc drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering about cards and whispering the name Eliza in his fever dreams. Thorne stayed awake, his senses stretched to their breaking point. He was a man accustomed to danger, but this was different. He wasn't waiting for a band of outlaws who could be met with lead and steel. He was waiting for a woman who might not even need a weapon to kill, a woman whose greatest power was the belief she instilled in others. Just after midnight, he heard it. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a change in the atmosphere. The chirping of the crickets ceased abruptly. The air grew still and cold. Thorne brought the rifle to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape, and then he saw her. She was moving across the plains, a solitary figure cloaked in shadow. She moved not with the urgency of a pursuer, but with the calm, deliberate pace of a shepherdess coming to collect a lost sheep. She carried no rifle, no lantern. In her hand was a small, dark satchel. She seemed to glide over the uneven ground, her focus entirely on the rock formation where they were hidden. She knew they were there. She had known all along. Thorne's heart hammered against his ribs. The confrontation he had sought was finally upon him, not in the familiar chaos of a town, but out here in the vast, empty wilderness under the cold, indifferent gaze of the moon. "Marshal Thorne," her voice drifted across the stillness, calm and melodic, devoid of surprise. I should have known a man of your persistence would interfere. She stopped about 50 yards from their position, a silhouette against the starry sky. She showed no fear, only a mild, almost academic curiosity. You are prolonging the inevitable. He belongs to me. His luck is spent. Thorne kept his rifle trained on her. It's over, Eliza. I found the jars. I know what you are. Soft, musical laugh was her only reply. It was a sound utterly at odds with the grim reality of the situation, a chilling, beautiful note in the heart of the darkness. What I am, Marshall, I'm a survivor. I take what this world refuses to give me. I take the luck that men squander on cards and cheap whiskey. Is that so different from a banker taking a man's farm when his luck runs out? Leclerc, hearing her voice, began to stir, moaning in terror. Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. You're a murderer, a butcher. Words, she scoffed, taking a slow step forward. You see butchery, I see a balancing of the scales, a transfer of fortune. Every man in that saloon is a gambler, Marshall. They wager their money, their horses, their lives. I simply collect the wager when they lose. Her logic was twisted, insane, yet delivered with such conviction that it was profoundly unsettling. She was not a mindless killer. She was operating under a horrifying, self-made moral code, a philosophy born in some deep, dark corner of her past. This twisted philosophy was the key. Thorne realized that to death. Eat her, he couldn't rely on his gun alone. He had to understand the source of her horrifying belief system. Tell me about the Sabine River, Eliza, he said, his voice steady. Tell me what happened to your family. For the first time, her serene composure faltered. The silhouette stiffened. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Thorne thought she would simply turn and vanish back into the night. But then she spoke, her voice losing its melodic quality, becoming flat and cold like a stone dropping into a deep well. Bushwhackers, she said. Renegades who fought for neither side, only for themselves. They came to our farm. My father was a man of principle. He believed in luck. He believed if you worked hard and were good, fortune would smile on you. She paused, and the darkness seemed to deepen around her. They took everything, our food, our livestock. And then they made my father play a game of cards for our lives, for my mother, for me. The story was horrifying, a chilling echo of the games she now presided over at the Gilded Cage. The events of her past were not just a memory. They were a script she was now forcing others to relive, with herself in the role of the arbiter of fate. Jedediah was no longer just a marshal. He was a reluctant confessor, hearing the origin story of a demon. We uncover band histories like this every week on our channel. If you want to understand the darkness that creates such monsters, join us, and you won't miss the descent into madness that comes next. My father played the best game of his life, Lily continued, her voice a monotone whisper that carried unnervingly in the still air. He had a winning hand. He laid his cards down on the table, his face shining with relief. He believed his luck had held. He believed goodness had prevailed. She took another step forward, her form becoming clearer in the moonlight. Thorne could see the glint of her pale face, her dark eyes fixed on him. The leader of the bushwhackers just laughed. He looked at my father's winning hand and said, "Your luck is strong, old man. I think I'll take it." And then he shot him. He shot my mother, and he took a knife, and he cut out my father's heart right there on the farmhouse floor. The confession was delivered with a chilling lack of emotion. It was a recitation of fact, a memory worn smooth by countless retellings inside her own mind. He held it up and said, "The heart of a lucky man, a powerful charm." Then they left me there, alone. For 3 days, with them, and with that lesson, Thorne finally understood. The horror, the trauma, the absolute perversion of hope and luck. She wasn't just killing men. She was reenacting the single most horrifying event of her life over and over. But in her version, she was the one in control. She was the one holding the knife. She was the one harvesting the luck. It was a grotesque, ritualistic attempt to reclaim a power that had been brutally stolen from her as a child. "So you do the same," Thorne said, his voice rough with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You find a lucky man and you take his heart." "I take what is owed," she corrected him, her voice regaining its cold confidence. "I am merely a collector of a debt. The world owes me, and Mr. Leclerc's debt is now due." She took another step and another, her movements slow and deliberate. She was closing the distance, testing his resolve. "Put the gun down, Marshall. This does not concern you. This is a private transaction between me and him. Thorn kept the rifle aimed at her center mass. I made a vow to uphold the law. What you do is not law, it's an abomination. The law, she laughed again, that same horrifyingly beautiful sound. What law was there for me on that farmhouse floor? What marshal came to save my mother? Your law is a fantasy, a story you tell yourselves to keep the darkness at bay. I live in the world as it is, not as you pretend it to be. A world where luck is a commodity that can be held in your hand. A world where the strong take from the weak. She was now close enough for him to see her face clearly. There was no madness in her eyes. There was only a terrifying clarity, an absolute certainty in her worldview. It was the calm of a fanatic, a faith grounded in blood and horror. This was the most disturbing part of all. She truly believed in what she was doing. His luck is already mine, Marshal, she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The moment he accepted my drink, the moment he let me stand behind his chair, he made a pact. His fall from the horse was not an accident, it was a consequence. The world bending to my will, it always does. She opened the small satchel she was carrying. Thorn tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a long, thin knife, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. It was a skinning knife, wickedly sharp, a tool of a butcher. I don't want to harm you, Marshal, she said, her tone almost gentle. You are a man of conviction, and I respect that, but you are in my way. Step aside. Leclerc moaned again, a pathetic, terrified sound. The noise seemed to trigger something in her. Her eyes shifted from Thorn to the injured man, and a predatory hunger entered her expression. Her facade of philosophical debate was falling away, revealing the raw, horrifying need beneath. Thorn knew that the time for talking was over. He couldn't reason with her. He couldn't appeal to a humanity that had been carved out of her years ago. He had only one option left. That's close enough, he warned, his voice a low growl. She ignored him. She took another step, her knife held at her side, her eyes locked on her prize. Thorn cocked the hammer on his rifle. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the silence. It was a sound that usually gave men pause. Lily didn't even flinch. You think that can stop me, she whispered, a faint, pitying smile on her lips. Your little piece of metal, this is a matter of fate, Marshal, and fate cannot be shot. She took the final step that brought her into the small clearing before the rocks. She was now well within range, an easy target, but Thorn hesitated. To shoot her down in cold blood, even knowing what she was, went against every fiber of his being. She was still a woman, a victim of a horror that had twisted her into this monstrous shape. In that moment of hesitation, she moved. She didn't lunge at Thorn as he expected. She darted towards Leclerc, her speed startling, unnatural. Thorn reacted instantly, swinging the rifle and firing. The shot boomed through the night, a deafening roar that sent a shockwave through the air. The bullet tore through the fabric of her dark dress, and she cried out, a sharp, pained gasp. She stumbled, falling to one knee, the knife clattering against the stones. Thorn was on his feet in a second, the rifle ready, moving towards her. He had wounded her, but he didn't know how badly. As he approached, she looked up at him, her face contorted not in pain but in sheer, unadulterated fury. You have ruined it, she hissed, clutching her side where a dark stain was already spreading. You have interfered with the ritual. And then she did something he never expected. She smiled. A wide, terrifying smile. But the debt must be paid. With a sudden, desperate lunge, she grabbed the knife from the ground. But instead of turning it on Thorn or Leclerc, she did something horrifyingly unexpected. She plunged it into her own abdomen just below the ribs. Her eyes locked with Thorn's, a look of triumphant spite on her face. If I cannot have his heart, she gasped, her voice already growing weak, I will take my own. Thorn stood frozen for a second, utterly shocked by her action. This was not in the script. Killers did not do this. Monsters fought to the last breath. Her macabre act was a final, insane move in a game only she understood. He rushed forward, kicking the knife away from her grasp as she slumped to the ground. She was bleeding profusely from two wounds now, his and her own. Her breath came in ragged, wet gasps. Leclerc, who had witnessed the whole thing, let out a choked, hysterical sob. Thorn knelt beside her, a lawman again, his instincts taking over. He tried to apply pressure to the wounds, but he knew it was useless. The damage was too severe. She looked up at him, her dark eyes beginning to glaze over. "My luck," she whispered, a trickle of blood running from the corner of her mouth. "It's running out." It was a chillingly literal final statement. Her life, her power, her entire twisted belief system was draining away into the thirsty Texas dirt. The curse was dying with its creator. Thorne watched as the life faded from her eyes. The fire that had burned there, the cold intelligence, the predatory hunger, the profound pain was extinguished, leaving only the vacant stare of death. The legendary Lucky Lily, the curse of perdition, was gone. The silence that descended was deeper and more profound than before. It was the silence of an ended story, a completed ritual. Leclerc's quiet, broken sobs were the only sound. Thorne stood up, his body aching with exhaustion and adrenaline. He looked from Lily's still form to the terrified, broken man huddled in the rocks. He had saved him. He had stopped the killer. But there was no sense of victory, only a vast, hollow emptiness. The horror of what she was and what had made her left a stain on the night, a stain on his soul. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had looked back, and then it had torn itself apart before his very eyes. He knew he had a long ride ahead of him, a journey to get Leclerc back to civilization, and a difficult report to write. How could he possibly explain this? A saloon girl who collected human hearts in jars, a woman who believed she was harvesting luck. They would call him insane. They would say the sun and the solitude of the frontier had finally broken him. Truth was often far more unbelievable than fiction, and the truth of Eliza May was a forbidden story that the civilized world would never accept. He decided to bury her there on the lonely prairie where she had met her end. It felt wrong to bring her body back to perdition, to make a spectacle of her death. Her life had been a macabre performance, and he would not allow her death to be the final act. He wrapped her in her dark cloak and laid her in a shallow grave, piling stones on top to protect her from scavengers. There was no prayer, no final words. Just the grim, silent work of a man closing a chapter that should never have been opened. As he finished, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, casting a pale, gray light on the scene. He looked down at the mound of rocks and felt a strange, unsettling thought. By killing herself, had she won? She had denied him his justice. She had denied the world its chance to judge her, to lock her away, to call her a monster. She had written her own ending, as bloody and macabre as her life had been. It was a final act of control, a final assertion of her own twisted will. She had escaped in the only way left to her. The thought sent a fresh chill down Thorne's spine. He had stopped the killings, but he hadn't defeated her. In the end, she had defeated herself on her own terms. The curse was over, but the legend was just beginning. Getting Leclerc back to the nearest town with a doctor was an ordeal. The man was delirious with fever and fear, his leg injury worsening. Thorne had to fashion a travois and drag him slowly across the plains. During the 2-day journey, Leclerc's ramblings were a constant, horrifying reminder of the events that had transpired. He spoke of Lily's eyes, of the cold feeling in his chest, of the cards turning against him as if guided by an unseen hand. He was a man not just physically broken, but spiritually shattered. He had come face to face with a force he couldn't comprehend, and it had broken his mind. When they finally reached the town of Fort Griffin, Thorne left Leclerc in the care of a doctor and made his report to the local marshal. He told a simplified, sanitized version of the story. He said he'd tracked a killer named Eliza May, who was responsible for the disappearances, and that she had resisted arrest and been killed in the ensuing struggle. He left out the jars, the rituals, the talk of stolen luck and harvested hearts. He knew it would do no good. The official record would list her as just another outlaw, another casualty of the violent frontier. The horrifying truth would be his burden to carry alone. He had to protect the world from a story it wasn't ready to hear. Some cold cases are closed on paper, but they remain open in the minds of those who were there. Thorne returned to perdition a week later. The town was already changing. With Lily gone, the supernatural luck of the gilded cage had vanished. The card tables were quieter, the winnings smaller. The boisterous gold entered dissipated. by the mundane, desperate atmosphere of any other struggling frontier town. Silas Blackwood, the saloon owner, was sullen and tight-lipped. His golden goose was dead, and he refused to speak of her. The other girls at the saloon spoke of Lily in hushed, fearful whispers, as if she were a ghost who might overhear them. Her room above the saloon remained empty, a silent, haunted space. Thorne went up there one last time. He half expected the carpet bag and its horrifying contents to be gone, a final supernatural trick. But they were still there, tucked away in the wardrobe. He took the bag and 5 jars, and that night under the cover of darkness, he rode out to the same stretch of prairie where he had buried her. One by one, he dug 5 small holes and buried the hearts, returning them to the earth. It felt like a necessary act, a way to lay the spirits of her victims to rest. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that Lily's ghost was observing his every move from the shadows, her cold eyes judging his clumsy attempt to bring order to her chaos. The story of what truly happened on that prairie never passed Marshall Thorne's lips, but folklore has a life of its own. The sanitized official story of a female was placed more tantalizing and far more accurate legend. The men who had been at the poker table with Leclerc told stories of how Lily's presence had turned the tide, of a palpable coldness in the air, of a power they could feel but not see. The women of the saloon whispered the tale of the rancher's horse. Beau Leclerc, once he recovered his health, never fully recovered his mind. He spent the rest of his days as a drunk in New Orleans, telling anyone who would listen about the Heart Lady of Texas, the witch who could steal a man's luck and his soul. Over the years, the story grew and twisted. Lily became a phantom, a succubus, a vengeful spirit of the frontier. They said that on moonless nights, you could see her ghost roaming the plains, searching for the hearts of arrogant, lucky men. The Gilded Cage Saloon eventually burned to the ground in a mysterious fire a few years later, erasing the last physical trace of her existence. But the legend of Lucky Lily, the saloon girl who cut out men's hearts for luck, became a permanent part of the dark, forbidden history of Texas. What is the nature of a curse? Is it a supernatural force, a tangible evil that can be summoned and directed? Or is it something more insidious? Is it the power of belief itself? Eliza May was undoubtedly a serial killer. This woman manifested in a series of horrifying ritualistic murders. Her methods were brutally physical. She used her intelligence and charm to lure her victims, and a sharp knife to commit her crimes. The jars in her room were not artifacts of magic. They were the gruesome trophies of a predator. And yet, the question of her luck lingers. Did she truly have the power to influence fate, to drain the good fortune from one person and hoard it for herself? Or did she simply possess an almost supernatural ability to read people, to identify the confident, arrogant men who were most susceptible to her charms and, later, to her terror? Her victims believed in her power, and in the end, that belief may have been the most potent weapon in her arsenal. She didn't need to conjure spirits or cast spells. She only needed to plant the seed of fear in a man's mind and let his own superstition do the rest. Beau Leclerc's horse didn't fall because of a hex. It fell because its rider was blind with terror, pushing the animal beyond its limits in a desperate flight from a phantom. The Queen of Hearts, the calling card she left with Silas Croft, remains the most enigmatic piece of the puzzle. Was it a nod to the New Orleans legend of Les Dames de Coeur that Leclerc spoke of, a legend she may have heard and adopted for her own twisted purposes? Or was it something more personal, a reference to the card game that sealed her family's fate, a final, bitter joke played on the men whose own hearts she was about to claim? It served as a symbol of her dominion, a fusion of love and death, of luck and violence. In the world of cards, the Queen of Hearts is often a symbol of a beloved woman, of beauty and desire. Lily twisted this symbol into something macabre and terrifying, a warning that the object of your desire could also be the instrument of your doom. It was a perfect representation of her own predatory nature, drawing men in with the promise of fortune and affection, only to leave with no mission statement, a small piece of paper that held the entire weight of her horrifying story. It's a detail that elevates her from a mere murderer to a figure of chilling, mythic proportions, a true queen of a horrifying, forbidden kingdom. Marshal Elias Thorne served as a lawman for another 20 years. He was known as a quiet, thoughtful man, respected for his unwavering sense of duty, but also known for a certain sadness that never seemed to leave his eyes. He never married, never had a family. He never spoke of the case of Eliza May again, but those who knew him said that he never played a game of cards for the rest of his life. He had seen firsthand how a simple game of chance could become a matter of life and death, how the turn of a card could be linked to the most profound and disturbing acts of human cruelty. The memory of the jars, of her final, defiant act on the prairie, became a part of him, a cold spot in his soul that never warmed. He had brought an end to her reign of terror, but at a cost. He had been forced to confront the fact that evil is not always a simple matter of greed or rage. Sometimes it is a philosophy, a religion of one, born from an agony so profound that it warps the very fabric of a person's soul. He had looked a monster in the eye and seen the broken child cowering behind it, and that is a vision no man can ever truly unsee. Today, the town of Perdition, Texas, no longer exists. It is another ghost town, its buildings long since collapsed and returned to the dust from which they came. The gilded cage is gone, as are the desperate men and women who once sought their fortunes within its walls. But legends are harder to kill than towns. Even now, in the more remote parts of West Texas, you might hear whispers of the Saloon girl's curse. Campfire stories told to frighten greenhorns, tales of a beautiful, dark-haired phantom who walks the plains. They say she can grant a man impossible luck at cards or dice, but the price is always the same. They say if you are ever alone on the prairie at night, and you hear the faint sound of a woman singing a sad, mournful ballad, you must turn and ride in the other direction as fast as you can, for it is the ghost of Lucky Lily, still searching, still collecting, still trying to balance the scales of a horrifying injustice that happened over a century and a half ago. It is a classic ghost story, a piece of macabre folklore, but like all the best stories, it is rooted in a dark and disturbing truth. A truth about the violence of the frontier, the power of superstition, and the horrifying things a human soul is capable of when it has been pushed past the breaking point. In the end, we are left with a story that lingers like a chill in the air. The tale of Eliza Lily May is a journey into the heart of American folklore, a place where history and horror intertwine. It is a cold case that was solved, yet remains profoundly unresolved. The physical evidence, the jars, the bodies, is long gone, lost to the passage of time. All that remains is the unsettling legend. Was she a witch, a practitioner of a forbidden, blood-soaked magic who could literally steal a man's luck by taking his heart? Or was she a brilliant and terrifyingly manipulative killer, a woman who weaponized superstition itself, turning the fears and beliefs of her victims against them in the most horrifying way imaginable? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in the murky space between. She was a product of her violent time, a ghost created by a war that respected no laws and a frontier that offered no mercy. And so her own ghost endures, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark, a reminder that the deepest horrors are not the monsters that lurk in the shadows, but the ones we create ourselves, forged in the fires of unimaginable pain. The question is not whether her curse was real. The question is whether it ever truly ended.